Right guys, so welcome to day 2. Now I'm going to be using some sliders for these. Now you don't need to buy sliders, it's just on carpet. So rather than getting carpet burns on my knees and having to explain to my missus when I get home why I've got carpet burns on my knees, I'm going to use some sliders. So that's the only reason I've got these. You don't need these for this exercise. If you're doing it on the matted gym floor, you're just going to move your knees slightly further apart. Now the first 2 movements, we're going to spend some time opening up the hips. So your hip mobility is very important in terms of getting into position in both your squat and your deadlift. And I think this is probably the biggest single driver for the majority of back problems that I see, is that your hips get so stiff, it takes 100 kilos of pressure on your spine. So in the squat position, you have to load your bar up with 100 kilos to be able to get to hip depth. Now your front squat is obviously, it's deeper than a back squat. The load's at the front rather than at the back, as the name suggests. So the demands are slightly different, but hip mobility is still a huge prerequisite. Now, there's 2 things we're going to do. We're going to open up the hips, and I'm going to show you an exercise you've done before with a twist. And then the second thing we're going to do is fire up the external rotators. So glute med, glute min, tensor fascial lata, your glute max muscle, piriformis. So some of these muscles that sit around the side and the back of the hips, which we're going to use so that the brain becomes aware of this new range of movement. So the addition we're going to add onto the hip opener is something called a PNF stretch, a proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation stretch. This is where you contract into the floor, and then as you relax, the relaxation following a contraction is much greater. So you'll find that you can take your knees further apart, create better abduction mobility and therefore hip depth with much more ease. However, with stretching, like we talked about it before, the problems with stretching is you increase your range of movement and the brain isn't aware of that new range. So the second movement, which is a banded fire hydrant, we're then going to use to make the brain aware of this additional range of movement. And then the final piece on this particular day is a straight on pull down. Now, this is an activation exercise for your lats. You may be thinking, well, what's that got to do with my deadlift or my squat? Well, your lats are a huge muscle. They go from the front of your shoulder in the floor of the bicipital groove. That's where your biceps tendon runs. So when you get shoulder pain here, that's often what's irritating in the front of your shoulder. It's not your delt, your front delt, it's your long head of biceps. They then go underneath the armpit, all the way down the back, and then they attach, 50% of the people they attach onto the inferior angle of the scapula, so your shoulder blade, and then the rest, they go all the way onto the back of your pelvis via something called the thoracolumbar fascia. Easy for me to say. Now the thoracolumbar fascia is a big sheet of fascia. You've probably all heard about fascia and probably seen some of those horrific videos where people are scraping. But if you check out our Instagram accounts over the next couple of days, you'll probably find there'll be a post on there where I try and dispel some of the myths about that practice. I think it's akin to ABH. Fascia is an incredibly strong structure. It's what gives your body its shape and maintains that body shape. So when you think about, pushing 200 kilos or lifting up to 200-300 kilos in a yoke, if your fascia was malleable, if you could change the length of it, then essentially every time you lifted something, your body would deform, and it doesn't, it stays rigid, because fascia can withstand up to 2,000 pounds of force. So the final exercise on this particular day is an exercise for the lats. We've talked about the attachment points. The significance is, this is one of the only spinal muscles that goes from basically the bottom of your neck all the way down to the bottom of your back. If you're not utilising your lat dorsi, when you're bracing, you're missing a huge part of your spinal stability. So we're going to fire up the lats, and then we're going to think about taking armpits down to pelvis, so pulling the armpit to pelvis when we're squatting, when we're deadlifting, to make sure that we're activating those lats and creating better spinal stability. So into your 4-point kneeling position, I nearly said doggy position there, but into your 4-point kneeling, try and get your feet, so the insides of your feet are resting onto the floor. So we're in an externally rotated position. Hands under the shoulders, and then we're going to spend a few repetitions, because bear in mind that you're cold at this point, just warming ourselves up, opening up the hips, just trying to basically make sure we've got a degree of mobility before we start to move into this P and F thing we're going to talk about. So every time I drop back into this position, I'm trying to push my feet further onto the floor. I'm trying to push my bum further onto my heels. So I'm trying to open up the hips and create some mobility in that position. If you think about this position here, it's like the bottom position of your squat. I'm obviously a lot lower now, but we're starting and working through a position that resembles what you're about to go and do. And I think all good rehab or movement prep should be as close to resembling the exercise you're about to move into as actually the exercise itself. So when we get down here this time, we're going to stop at the 90-90 position. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to squeeze my knees into the floor. So I'm going to try and fire up the adductors. So I'm basically squeezing my knees into the floor as hard as I can. And then as I relax, I'm going to either walk my knees out into a slightly wider position, or if you're on sliders, let them slide out. Now when you've found that new position, I want you to ease back into the stretch. Now you'll find that's a much greater stretch through the inside of your thighs. That's a much greater stretch through the back of the hip. And we're going to camp out here for about 20 seconds. So time has elapsed. I'm then going to do the same thing. So I'm going to squeeze my knees into the floor. Now you're in an outer range of movement here, so you're not going to be able to exert as much force as you did on the first repetition. It'll feel harder to contract. Hold for 10 seconds and then relax into your next position. And then we're going to camp out there for about 20 to 30 seconds. So that's the first piece. Right, so these is your banded fire hydrants. Now this little band here is a hip circle. No, don't worry, I haven't joined the bikini brigade trying to do my glutes every day. This is a really nice piece of kit to fire up your external rotators and make your brain aware of that new range of movements. Now these can be bought from Gunsmith Fitness. I think they're called mobility bands or mobility belts. We'll put the link on this video. And if you quote MOFO15, you'll get a 15% discount. So 4-point kneeling, set yourself into position, and then we're going to go out with a nice forceful contraction and then slow in. Out, nice forceful contraction and then slow in. Maintaining your back in a neutral position and making sure that you're trying to get the outside of your hip, so this is where you should feel it, around there, fired up and your brain aware of this new range of movement we've produced from the first exercise we did. So I do 6 to 8 on the left hand side, 6 to 8 on the right hand side. Remember, this is low load activation, so we're not looking to produce fatigue, we're looking just to connect with that muscle. So now we move on to our lat activation exercise. So again, we talked about the importance of the lats in the introduction. So we're now going to think about activating the lats, and then when you move on to your deadlift or onto any exercise where you're basically trying to create spinal stability, we're going to try and think about pulling the armpit towards the pelvis, which will help to engage those lats and keep that pulled in all the way through. So hands just slightly wider than shoulder width apart. You can go split stance, you can go side to side stance, and we're just going to make sure we're pulling using our back muscles. Now, it might take a couple of repetitions for you to start to feel this. We're in our hip hinge position, body's in line, abs are on, rib cage is down, and as we get to the bottom of the movement, we're really trying to squeeze that lat. So you can get some activation, get some blood flow into there, and start to feel what it feels like when it's fired. Now again on this, it's low load, so I've got a very small amount of weight, and I'm going to do as low a number of reps as I can to avoid too much fatigue for the main part of your session. So 6 to 8 reps, off you go.